Greetings, Ohio Valley. This is Dan Lima with OSU Extension from Belmont County.
And this is Karen Cox from WVU Extension in Ohio County. Thanks for tuning in to Extension Calling, your source for research-based information for the farm, garden, and home.
All right, so this week we thought we would dig into the root of many plant issues and talk about roots.
That's right. The place underground that we don't see that I would argue is one of the most important aspects of plant development.
And I would agree. You know, the roots absorb water, helps them seek out nutrients from the soil. Yeah, the leaves are where they make starches and sugars, but the plants need that connection to the soil. And a lot of the problems that we have when you see, like, especially with trees, most of the problems with wilting, things like that, it's going to really come down to the roots and what's going on under the soil.
You know, and just to add on to that, as far as roles of roots, just from a plant physiology point of view, it's easy to recognize the importance of hormones in mammals, right? But in plants, they have hormones too, and the hormones are made in different parts of the plant. Two hormones that are regulated in the roots are cytokinins and gibberellins, GA. Cytokinins are important for leaf expansion, shoot initiation, transpiration. They inhibit leaf senescence, so they hold on to the leaves. Gibberellins are good for stem elongation and flowering. So if you don't have roots producing these hormones, all these desired things that we want to see up top, we don't get to see because the roots are impacted. Whether that disease is just inhibiting the hormones themselves or just preventing the roots to grow to make these hormones. You know, either way, it's the roots are impacted by a disease or a problem of compaction where the roots just won't grow. But so, yeah, we need to have big roots for big results.
Right. And I'd said, especially for trees, but really these issues affect every single plant, from grasses to potted plants to the big things you see out in the world, the trees. So it doesn't matter what you're growing. If it's a plant, you need to be concerned about root health.
Yeah, and you know, the guys that are doing soybeans know that all too well. Wet years, poor drainage equals very bad soybeans.
Yeah, when you have poor drainage, I mean, that is probably the number one contributor to root-based diseases. Roots do need to breathe. They need to have they need to have air in some of that pore space. I mean, they obviously need to have some water in there, but too much water can be worse than not enough water.
Yeah, and then when we say things like root rots and crown rots, we're talking about so many different things. They're typically soil-borne, and they range from Phytophthora. People have heard of that nasty word, Rhizoctonia. People have heard that word, Fusarium. And these are all just fungal spores that are everywhere. And given the right environment, they can wreak havoc. So it's, you know, a lot of times when we talk about the disease triangle, right, we talk about the host being present, the pathogen being present, and the right environment. You know, sometimes the pathogen is always present. And I think with a lot of these root diseases and these fungal spores, you can't get away from that part of the disease triangle. What you can do is put maybe a host that's less susceptible, or maybe an environment that pathogen has no ability to infect the host. But a lot of times when we talk about fungal diseases, that pathogen is the part of the triangle that we cannot get away from.
Yeah, so you made a lot of really good points about that disease triangle, but something a lot of people don't consider is that roots can graft to one another under the soil. And so if you have a root-borne disease that can transfer to other roots because the roots are grafted underground, then plant spacing is a really big important thing, and that's something we're actually looking at with oak diseases. The Phytophthora ramorum can transfer through root grafts, and oaks are really good at grafting their roots together. In fact, if you see a whole street of oaks, they're probably all connected underground. And so, plant spacing is important, and recognizing that these root diseases, once they get into the plant, they spread through the root system. And oftentimes we don't even know there's an issue until it is too late to treat the issue. So we want to talk about, some of the things that you can look for, but more importantly, some of the things you can do to prevent root diseases from occurring.
And then I like how you're tying in the roots and how the roots are tying together with other plants, because plants do signal to each other. And one of the, if you're looking at just plant physiology as far as a general way that plants respond to pathogen attacks, something like herbivory, right? We always talk about grazing, and we never think about it from the plant perspective that the plants don't really like it, right? And one of the great examples of that is Kentucky 31 tall fescue, that actually has a compound to deter herbivory by making it taste bad, making the cattle not feel good when they eat too much of it, with the blood constriction and all those things. But like when plants actually get damaged or they get infected, and a lot of times that infection is caused by some kind of damage, they will release hormones and trigger molecules. One of them, which is something called jasmonic acid, and that's just kind of a generic signaling molecule that Karen was talking about. When trees fuse all their roots together, they respond to each other and they know something's coming. But certain signals will actually cause what's called a hypersensitive response, where if the pathogen infects a certain part of the plant, a lot of times when you see a diseased, you'll see like a diseased tree limb, and then the plant will actually callus over that diseased tissue to kind of contain the infection. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but it is a response to a disease infection.
Yeah, because that tree or that plant is trying to stop that infection from spreading. And so think about plants' vascular systems. They're very different from a human vascular system where our blood flows, constantly and whatnot. We don't cut off the blood flow to our hand when we cut our finger or we get an infection in our finger. It just keeps on trucking through. But plants, they're like, you know what? I don't need that finger anymore. Drop it off and protect the rest of the plant. And so a lot of times that's why you'll see a leaf drop or a stem drop, because the plant is saying, oh no, we need you to stay out. So we're keeping this infection locked into a certain location. And like Dan said, sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. There are some plants that are much better at what we call compartmentalizing that decay or that infectious problem. And some plants aren't as good at it. And so when you start to see things like a wilt or just significant dieback,
a lot of these diseases do cause the same things, and one of the reasons is because we're talking about the roots being responsible for so many different things. So in general, some of the symptoms you see for any root diseases are going to be things like wilting. They're going to be reduced in size. You're going to see foliar discoloration. Sometimes it's like a nutrient deficiency because the roots just aren't producing what they can and scavenging what they can. You'll see defoliation, and sometimes the plants die. The best way to tell is if you're able to do a side-by-side comparison, but a lot of times all those plants are affected at the same time. So let's say you have a field, right? And kind of going back to the soybean example, you have a field and part of the field is just really saturated and another part has good drainage. You know that they were planted all at the same time, but what you'll find is the plants that are really impacted by that heavy moisture, which is conducive to an array of fungal diseases, typically root rots and sometimes crown rots. But what you'll see is you'll see wilting, you'll see reduced size, you'll see discoloration, and it'll almost look like the plants aren't developing as quickly as their counterparts that have good drainage because of all those symptoms of a root-borne disease. And it all really, I would say 90% of the time goes to drainage issues.
Yes, it's too much water in the soil. That is a very large contributor. But it could also be, excessive rainfall. And for some types of plants, it could be that you planted it too deeply. And that can cause problems with access to oxygen for the roots as well. Dan was just talking about the crown. He's not talking about the crown that has all of the leaves on it. He's talking about the root crown, the part of the plant where the tissue type transitions from surface tissue to subterranean tissue. So the root crown has more protective parts to it than the stem. So the root crown has more chemicals in it that can protect it from moisture, whereas the stem doesn't have those. And we see this especially with trees where they get planted too deeply, but it also happens with other plants. Now, tomatoes, they're a completely different animal. You want to plant them really deep. But there are some plants that really don't respond to being planted too deeply. Corn is one of them. You plant those too deeply, those seedlings have a hard time getting up, getting their roots enough oxygen, and you'll see a lot of decay coming in right above that root crown and potentially causing the plant to die off.
Yeah, and let's not forget, because it is commonly forgotten, that corn is a grass, right? And grass has fibrous root systems, and fibrous root systems like to spread out and they like to be shallow. So you plant it too deep, and that kind of goes against the genetics and that physiology of that plant. But something else that we typically don't think about in a landscaping type of environment, when we are putting a tree down and we mulch around it, that mulch is also going to retain moisture. So by over mulching, sometimes with rains, two things can happen. You can either trap the moisture in there so it gets too much moisture and causes all those problems that we've been talking about, where the environment's going to be a lot more conducive to an infection of that crown that we're talking about, the transition point between the shoot and the roots. Typically, it's just right on the soil line, or if it's really compacted, sometimes you can actually prevent water from getting in, and that leads to other problems. But a lot of times, if you have over mulched and you have a clay soil that likes to hold on to water, that over mulching can cause fungal problems in the roots and the crown of the tree, because the water just isn't evaporating and it just sits there, and it creates an environment that's more conducive to the pathogen infecting that host, going back to that disease triangle.
Yeah, and that is exactly why volcano mulching is so bad for trees, because not only do you have that super deep layer of mulch, but it's up against the trunk of the tree, which retains moisture in an area that the tree is not designed to absorb moisture. And that moisture goes into the bark and can help soften that bark and allow an opportunity for a pathogen to get into the system. Now, there's other things, though, that can lead to this infection, because with the disease triangle, you have to have that source. The source of the infectious agent has to be present in order for the disease to happen. And so moving out of the yard and into the garden, or into maybe your starting, which, some people are starting plants. If you have a high tunnel or a greenhouse, there are people that are starting plants about this time of year, or maybe getting ready to. But you can also, by using garden soil to fill your seedling trays, you could introduce pathogens that can cause your new little seedlings to damp off. That damping off disease where they're growing great, and then all of a sudden they all just die, and they've got that little black ring around the base where it's touching the soil line. And these can be spores of fusarium, can be moved by insects or gnats, and they can even be moved by splashing irrigation water, so depending on how you're irrigating these seedlings. But there's also pythium, and pythium can be brought in on your hands. It can be dirty tools or hose ends, even if they've been in contact with dirt and debris. And so if there's like a little clump of dirt on the end of your hose that you're spraying on your little seedlings, every little molecule of these pythium are hitching a ride in that irrigation water, landing on your soil, and then it finds your seedlings and can kill them.
Yeah, and pythium is such a huge problem in greenhouses.
Yeah.
And all those things that you said, contaminated tools, pots, flats, things that we're using regularly, contaminated cuttings, plugs, floor hoses like you were talking about. And a lot of times recycling of irrigation water If it's already contaminated, all you're doing is re-exposing the plants. And that greenhouse environment can also be a very good way to keep the humidity high, keep things really favorable for the Pythium root rot to just thrive in all the plants that are in the greenhouse. Poor drainage, excessive irrigation and splashing, and then just not managing things like algae, algae that are growing in the walls, just keeping that moisture there are all horrible ways that Pythium can really take a hold of a greenhouse area and just devastate all your plants.
So if you've ever pulled out your plant and, why did this die? And you pull it out and the roots just sort of slough off, leaving a little string behind. So like the outer part of the root is black and decayed and kind of falls off. That is probably Pythium. That's a pretty characteristic one. You'll see your leaves wilting or yellowing. But that is probably what you're looking at there. If you have Pythium, you want to sanitize anything that has been in contact with that soil or that water, because like Dan said, it does move through the water.
Yeah, and sometimes we talk about fungicides. We talk about chemicals that should prevent the infection of a fungal pathogen. But the thing we have to understand about fungicides is in that disease triangle where you have the pathogen, environment, and host, what the fungicides will do is help prevent the infection process onto the host. Once that already happened, like once you start seeing fungal spores and you'll start to see the signs of a fungal infection, no matter what it is, that fungicide is ineffective. So fungicides are really preventative, and what they do is in times where that disease triangle is just very conducive to infection, it does help prevent that mechanism of infiltration of the fungal spore into the plant. So it's really just another level of barrier when everything else has failed. You can't rely on that 100% of the time, but the way that most commercial producers successfully manage fungicides is they know when the times are going to be more critical that pathogens going to infect the plants, and they're able to put that barrier there temporarily to prevent that infection. And what they do on 90% of the time is try to keep things conducive to prevent that disease triangle from all the components, the pathogen, environment, and host, being conducive to that infection. When we talk about the right plant in the right place, if we're talking about root rot problems, we're talking about moisture levels. So don't overwater or don't plant something with poor drain in an area with poor drainage if it's highly susceptible to it. And there's so many different things that will cause root rots, but the underlining thing that they all have in common is moisture. Having the moisture level too high.
Right. And so let's say that you have a field and you need to increase your drainage for that field. You need to reduce the amount of moisture in the soil. What can you do? So a lot of farm fields utilize tiles, which is basically a perforated pipe that runs underground through the field, sort of like a French drain that you would put around your house, but for your farm field. And those pipes move water from one location to another. So important aspects you need to be aware of that is, where are you moving the water to? Because it's not just going to disappear out of your field. Water doesn't just do that. It will move someplace else. So you have to make sure that when your drains are coming out somewhere, that they're not going to come out in a place where they're going to cause more problems. Also, for you home gardeners, think about where your drainage from your roof is coming off. If your roof is draining right into your garden, then you're probably going to drown your plants. You might think, oh, that'd be great, then I don't have to irrigate. But you're talking about, like what is it? 4,000 gallons of water per inch of rain on a typical roof. There's actually some calculators out there that you can use to find out how much water your gutters are putting into your yard. But you want to either use a couple rain barrels, because that 55-gallon drum is going to fill up super fast, a cistern, or just keep it directed away from the garden and water it in another way so that you're not over watering. Because like we said, overwatering is worse than underwatering. Houseplants, overwatering there is very rough. Make sure that the soil is dry to the touch, 1 inch down. So shove your finger down in the soil, and if it feels moist, don't water it. Let it dry out. If you're growing succulents, that's a whole other issue of too much water. Be really careful about watering succulents.
And always have pots that have drainage. Pots without...
Oh, if your pot doesn't have a hole, throw it out or drill it. One of the two.
It's just too difficult to manage. It just does not work. I know there are pots that you just want to keep because they look so good, but if it doesn't have drainage, it's no good. You're not.
Yeah, you can use it for fake flowers.
That's right.
If you think the pot's that beautiful and you can't drill it. Because sometimes ceramic does shatter when you try to drill it. And some of those old ceramic pots, they really are pretty. And if you try to drill them, they could shatter. So if you want to keep that pot and utilize it, put another pot inside of it that does have drainage holes and make sure it's elevated so that it can actually drain out of the pot that you actually have plants in. So that actually can help reduce the amount of soil you have too. If it's one of those really big pots, put a smaller pot inside of it and then make sure that it sets properly to drain.
And if you see fungus gnats, fungus gnats are nature's way of saying stop watering.
This is true. This is true. That means you're giving them too much water too frequently.
Yeah, the best spray for fungus gnats is just not to water that much. Yeah. There's only one thing. The fungus gnats are a great signal that you are overwatering. So if you start to see fungus gnats anywhere, you're overwatering something.
Yeah, and they are a pain in the butt to get rid of because they'll jump between your pots. And so if one's been too dry and one's been too wet, they'll find the wet one. And they'll lay their eggs in the soil, and then the larvae feed on the roots, and then the adults are irritating. We'll just leave it at that. Now, when it comes to let's say a place where you can't install a drain tile because it's not a farm field, you can't always call 811 before you install drain tiles. Always call 811. And that's our safety message for today. But if you have, let's say your yard, you can't really put in a drain tile in your yard. French drains are expensive. You want to improve the drainage. Well, we talked earlier about mulch holding moisture, but mulch can also help improve drainage. But it takes a long, long time. We're talking, 3 to 5 years before that mulch breaks down enough to build the microorganisms and macroorganisms in the soil, to build those drainage pods from eating that organic matter. But increasing the organic matter content in your garden soil or even your yard will improve drainage. So when you're looking at your fall leaves, mow them in, don't rake them off. That way those nutrients go back into the soil. And also that organic matter builds up over time. But also aerating your lawn. So using and it's almost like trying to pull out soil cores. You have a plug system that pulls out little things that makes it look like a goose pooped all over your yard. Using an aeration system every fall is a great opportunity because then the freeze-thaw cycle can help improve the aeration that you started in the fall. But don't use the one where you just stick a hole in the ground where it pushes it outward, like golf cleats or something like that. You actually want to get the one that pulls the plugs out to aerate your soil, and that will help improve drainage in a yard type situation. So say if you have rhododendrons or dogwoods, roses, all those plants that really don't like to have wet feet, if you're planting them in this clay soil, using mulch, aerating are the main things you can do to help, unless you can move that plant into a better location.
Yeah, and instead of the word mulch, you could throw in the word compost.
Yeah.
The organic matter is the key point there. And that's all I wanted to kind of touch on when you were talking about how compost will eventually help improve the texture and the drainage. It's the organic matter, but you can also obtain that through composting. So using compost is a great way to help drainage, help texture. But yeah, aeration is great because it gives you the physical property of the freeze thaw and allowing that oxygen to penetrate and break up those compacted soil structures that prevent drainage and aeration, and will then allow the roots to grow better. And again, it's that environment and the disease triangle is what you're improving there with things like compost and aeration.
Yeah. And compost, it's going to work faster than mulch will because it's already broken down. It's sort of the difference between absorbing the nutrients from a smoothie, where you don't have to chew that, versus a salad, which you have to chew. So that's basically the difference there. So when you're providing that smoothie of nutrients to those micro and macroorganisms in the soil, they can get to it more quickly and utilize it more quickly. Consider if it rains hard, is it going to run off on the soil? What can you do to reduce the impact of rain? So if you have an open garden and it rains, it's going to block off the surface. So then you're not going to get it infiltrating down into the soil. And that's a whole nother problem for another show that deals with moisture in the soil.
And if you're buying plants, like we kind of talked about this earlier, but if you're buying plants in a tray, if you're getting those plugs that you're going to put in the garden, and as you're pulling them out, if you don't see nice white big roots, or if that little seedling is wilty, chances are it's already infected. So what you're doing now is you're basically putting an infected plant in place, and once the plant's infected, it doesn't matter how much you make the environment conducive to that plant, it won't be the same. We talked about how plants compartmentalize those disease tissues. If it's a real small plant, compartmentalizing something is going to make a major stressor on that plant. So
yeah, and they usually won't survive it.
A small plant that's infected is not a good way to start anything.
Yep. And so buy your seedlings and your starts from a reputable dealer. The big box stores aren't always the best option for that. A lot of our local farmers markets do have starts at the beginning of the year for gardens. So check with that. And also, if you get SNAP, you can use your SNAP dollars to purchase vegetable starts at farmers markets. So keep that in mind as well. And we also want to say thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next week.
Thanks for listening to Extension Calling. This show is a collaboration between OSU Belmont County Extension Educator Dan Lima and WVU Ohio County Extension Agent Karen Cox. If you'd like a transcript of this show, contact us at the office. Also, let us know if you enjoy the show by ranking us on your podcast app.